Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to ancient Egypt not for pharaohs, pyramids, or plagues, but for something far more comforting. Warm, crusty bread fresh from an oven older than the Bible. You're standing at the edge of Thebes, just before sunrise. The sky blushes in bands of coral and lavender, and the air still clings to the chill of the desert night. In the distance, the Nile glimmers like melted bronze, but you're not here to admire the view. You've got a job to do. You're headed to the baking quarter, yes. That was a thing where the smell of charcoal and sourdough hangs heavy even before the first loaf has risen. You probably won't survive this, to be honest. Between the heat, the sandstorms, and the occasional crocodile lurking near the water's edge, your career as a Bronze Age baker is going to be brief. But at least you'll go out smelling like cinnamon.so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from a cozy corner of the world, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You rub sleep from your eyes as you follow the winding dirt path into the city. The buildings are squat, sun-bleached, and made of mud brick, arranged like someone gave up halfway through a puzzle. You hear the sharp clack-clack of millstones in the distance, the first sounds of industry waking up. The city of Thebes isn't fully awake yet, but the bakers are. They always are. You pass a man herding ducks. One of them gives you a side eye that feels judgmental. You ignore it as you approach the bakery complex. The scent hits first. Warped grain, fermenting yeast, and smoke. A young girl jogs past you holding a bundle of reeds likely for kindling. You duck through an arched doorway, and suddenly you're in the belly of the beast. Rows of dome ovens, piles of flour sacks, and sweaty humans already 3 hours into their shift. Welcome to your new life. You're working for a man named Neferhotep. He doesn't smile much, but he knows his way around a loaf. He greets you with a grunt and a half-eaten date. You nod solemnly. That's baker talk for good morning. First task, haul the Emma wheat from the storage room. Emma, the stubborn cousin of modern wheat, is the foundation of all things doughy in Egypt. The grains are husked like tiny armor-plated tanks, so before you even get to grinding, you have to soak, pound, and sometimes whisper sweet nothings to get them to cooperate. You carry the sacks into the milling room, where two women are already bent over grindstones. Their arms move in slow, steady circles. The stones moan with each turn. You take your place and start grinding. It's meditative for about 10 minutes. Then your shoulders start to whine. Historians estimate that up to 30% of daily calories in ancient Egypt came from bread, which is sweet until you realize that to make enough flour for a single family took hours of grinding. No KitchenAid in sight, just you, your biceps, and your slow descent into repetitive strain injury. The flour is gritty not just figuratively. Ancient bread often had flecks of sand or crushed stone in it, thanks to the millstones wearing down. Archaeologists have found toothware in Egyptian mummies consistent with lifelong sand eating. You'll soon find yourself chewing on a loaf that feels like it came with optional gravel. Sleep-friendly, right? With your arms on fire and your flour quota met, you drag the sacks to the mixing room. Here, the bakers mix water, flour, a touch of leftover beer foam, yes, that's a thing, and begin the sacred, sticky ritual of kneading. The dough is heavy and unpredictable. Sometimes it bubbles beautifully. Sometimes it turns into a slimy lump that looks like it might come alive. Now here's a mainstream historical fact to keep in mind. Ancient Egyptian bread wasn't just food. It was currency. It was offering. It was the paycheck and the prayer, rolled into one dense, oblong package. Workers on the pyramids, paid in bread and beer. Priests at temples, fed through divine grain quotas. You are not just making lunch. You're fueling an empire. As your fingers squish through the damp dough, you overhear a debate near the ovens. Two older bakers are arguing softly, of course, in that weary, sleep-deprived way about whether to use yesterday's fermented mash as a starter or to trust the wild yeast in the air today. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptians understood fermentation as a science or just noticed, hey, this dough got bubbly and delicious when we forgot about it for a day. Either way, your next step is to shape the dough into loaves. You're aiming for the classic conical shape, easy to wedge into the oven walls. The texture, somewhere between memory foam and wet sponge. Delightful. A cheeky fringe fact for you. Recent analyses of carbonized bread remnants show that some loaves had filling states, figs, even bits of onion or garlic. Surprise! The world's first. Hot pockets may have come from thieves. As the sun rises higher and the sweat begins to pool under your headscarf, you glance outside. The Nile sparkles. A barge drifts by, full of singing fishermen. You've got flour in your ears and a full morning ahead, but it's oddly satisfying, in that back-breaking, hands-crusted in dough kind of way, and somewhere in the back of your mind you wonder, how in I's name are we going to keep this bread from turning into a soggy sponge by sundown? You'll find out soon enough. You blink the flour from your eyes and look down at your hands. They're no longer yours. Really just dough-coated tools with permanently crusty knuckles. Welcome to life as a baker's apprentice in ancient Thebes. The sun's up now, pouring thick golden light across the rooftops, and the temperature is climbing with the kind of quiet confidence that makes you deeply regret wearing wool sandals. Neferhotep grunts again. And you know what that means. Time to start your route. You're tasked with the most glamorous of duties, delivering the dough-filled clay pots to the fermentation chamber, which sounds a lot fancier than it is. Really, it's just a hot corner of the courtyard with a few sun-warmed walls, a hopeful amount of shade, and the occasional nosy cat. You balance a heavy tray of dough pots on your shoulder, walking carefully to avoid any splashes. Each clay pot is half full of floury goop. There's no commercial yeast here. It's all about natural fermentation, whatever wild yeast floats in from the river, the streets, or the neighbor's dubious beer vat. It's a little like baking roulette. You set the pots down and try to remember the order Neferhotep prefers. Left for early rise, center for longer fermentation, right for we forgot about these yesterday. As you wait, you use a damp reed to scrape the dried dough of your hands. It flakes like ancient parchment, the pots warm in the sun. You sit beside them, fanning yourself lazily with a cracked palm leaf and watching FLIs try to commit carbicide. The smell, sharp, sour, and oddly comforting. Fermentation is a living thing. You can hear faint popping, hissing sounds as tiny air bubbles form inside the dough. It feels like you're babysitting a swamp full of ambitious yeast. A fringe but fascinating fact: the oldest known yeast strain ever revived was from ancient Egyptian bread remnants. Scientists baked with it. Supposedly it tasted mildly sour. And like history, you decide you'll take their word for it. You glance toward the Nile. A water seller is hawking jugs to fishermen, and children are splashing each other near the banks. You wave at them. One throws a lotus flower at your head. Kids are the same in every century. Back to business. You poke one of the dough pots experimentally. It jiggles like a satisfied hippo. Time to move it to the ovens. You lug the heavy pots carefully back toward the main baking area. There, several bakers are already elbow-deep in flour, slapping dough onto curved baking stones and feeding fire into dome-shaped ovens known as taverns. These aren't your average kitchen appliances. They're squat, clay mounds that trap heat. Like a camel traps water efficiently, and with no intention of sharing. Your job now. Prepare the dough for baking. That means scooping it out of the clay pots and shaping it into little loaves, flat, round, conical, or sometimes vaguely abstract, depending on your skill level and patience. Neferhotep is muttering again. He's concerned. The humidity today is up, and that's never good news for a crisp crust. He gestures toward the woven mats that cover the bread as it rests. Don't let it sit too long, he says. We're not feeding the ducks, you nod solemnly. You've already had enough duck judgment for one day. There's something almost holy about the next steps. You coat the outer edges of the loaves with a light dusting of ash or flour. It's not just decorative. That thin layer can help protect the bread from sticking to the oven walls and possibly help keep it dry, at least for a little while. Or so the theory goes. Historians still argue whether this ash dusting technique was intentional or just a side effect of enthusiastic baking in open pits. You sidestep toward the oven. It radiates so much heat your eyelashes curl slightly. Using a long wooden paddle, you slide the loaves into the oven's curved inner walls. Some cling, some fall, one splats. You pretend not to see Neferhotep's raised eyebrow. As the bread bakes, the smell becomes borderline intoxicating, earthy, toasty, with a hint of barley and just the faintest whiff of sweat. The heat brings everything alive. Steam rises. The crust begins to darken, and for a moment, you feel like you're watching something ancient and alchemical happen. It's not fast. Each loaf takes time to set, especially if the oven's having a finicky day. You pass the time by poking a few finished loaves, tapping them for that hollow thunk that means they're cooked through. One baker swears by the ear test. You Hold the loaf close and listen for a tiny internal crackle. You try it. You hear your stomach growling. One baker nearby is humming softly. It's an old hymn to Torit, the goddess of childbirth and protection. Seems a little off topic, until you remember that in some districts, she was also asked to bless family food stores like bread. Maybe a few extra prayers will keep today's loaves from going soggy by midday. Finally, the first batch is done. You use tongs to pull the hot loaves out and lay them on reed trays to cool. The crust is golden, the shape mostly intentional. You breathe in the smell again. If heaven had a bakery, it might smell like this. You brush sweat from your brow and reach for the next set of dough pots. The cycle continues. Mix, rise, shape, bake, repeat. There's no pause, no lunch break, no air conditioning. But as you fall into the rhythm of it, there's a strange peace in the predictability, like waves on the Nile or the croak of frogs. At dusk, the baking process is endless and somehow soothing, and while nobody talks about it much, every baker here shares the same quiet fear: soggy bread. There are tricks, of course. You've heard whispers of people baking loaves with hollow reeds inside to let out steam, or shaping bread to mimic lotus flowers because the gods prefer dry petals. You don't know yet how you'll face the challenge, but it's coming. The sun is now climbing high enough that the shadows shrink and the clay walls of the bakery radiate stored heat like sleepy radiators. Your tunic sticks to your back. Somewhere, a bird calls loud enough to sound personally offended. And yet, you continue kneading dough with the steady rhythm of someone who's accepted their fate as a walking flour sack. This morning's loaves are cooling nicely, but your focus shifts to the next batch, specifically to what happens before it even goes near an oven. Because in ancient Egypt, dough was not a simple affair. It was a living, evolving creature that could either rise into a glorious crusty pillow or slump into a wet, gluey mess that not even a temple goat would touch. You head to the prep table, where Neferhotep has laid out a few sample doughs for inspection. Some are bubbling enthusiastically. Others lie still, like they know they've failed. He's talking to another baker about the clay fermentation parts, how the porous surface helps the dough breathe, preventing excess moisture buildup. You lean in to listen, pretending you weren't already daydreaming about napping in a sack of barley. Here's your mainstream fact of the day. The ancient Egyptians used a sort of proto-sourdough method, relying on wild yeast and bacteria to leaven their bread. This wasn't some culinary miracle, it was necessity. Commercial yeast wouldn't exist for thousands of years. Instead, they developed a system of leaving bits of dough from a previous bake and folding them into the new batch of practice we now call a vein. But back then, you just called it not messing up the only bread you're eating this week. One of the bakers scoops dough into a mold shaped like a fish. Another uses a simple oblong shape and presses a thumbprint into the center, a tradition whose meaning is mostly lost to time. Was it decorative? Was it practical for stacking? Historians still argue whether thumb-indented loaves indicated special purposes, like temple offerings or taxes in bread form. You, on the other hand, are wrestling with a stubbornly sticky mass that refuses to hold any shape. Neferhotep sighs at you in that special way reserved for apprentices. He reaches over, adds a pinch of barley flour, and works it through. Like magic, the dough calms down. You offer a sheepish, "I totally meant to do that" smile. He does not smile back. There's a delicate dance here, one that every baker learns in time. Too much moisture, and your loaf collapses. Too little, and it bakes into something resembling a sun-dried brick. Finding that balance, especially in a humid Nile-side bakery, requires experience, intuition, and sometimes just sheer dumb luck. Speaking of humidity, the air today feels like soup. One of the older bakers mutters about the sweat of the crocodile gods, which may or may not be a euphemism. You pretend to laugh, just in case it's a joke. As you shape your next loaf, you reach for a secret weapon: oil. Just a few drops, rubbed over the surface. Not only does it add flavor and sheen, it helps keep moisture from soaking into the loaf after baking. It's one of those clever little tricks passed from baker to baker, never written down, always half whispered like sacred knowledge. Another trick you've heard about: PI baking the clay mold itself before adding the dough. Some bakers believe this helps reduce post-bake sogginess. Others say it just makes the crust extra thick, like armor for your carbs. You look over at one of the more eccentric bakers, who is carefully layering fig leaves beneath her dough. Keeps the bottom dry, she claims. Also tastes like sunshine. You suspect that may be poetic license, but honestly, fig leaves do smell incredible when they toast, And now for a fringe tidbit. Archaeologists once found a loaf in a worker's tomb that had been stuffed with whole dates and sealed with a honey glaze. It was perfectly preserved for over 3,000 years, meaning someone was so worried about soggy bread, they practically embalmed it. Neferhotep calls you over to inspect a misbehaving loaf. It's too flat. You both crouch down and poke it like two detectives interrogating a lazy suspect. He mutters that the starter was tired, and maybe the air was too damp this morning. He's not sure, and honestly, neither are modern bakers. That's the magic and the frustration of bread. Even now, with all our fancy thermometers and timers, a loaf can flop for no clear reason. Back then, you just hoped the gods were in a good mood. You carry the dough to the resting mats near the oven. Loaves are draped in linen to prevent drying out during proofing. Linen, by the way, is a luxury. Many smaller bakeries would use palm fronds or even just more flour. But here, in Thebes, where the temple contracts are good and the noble orders never stop, you get linen. Fancy as the loaves rest. You sneak a sip from the cool water jug in the corner. It tastes faintly of clay and yesterday's steam, but it's heavenly. A breeze drifts in through the high window and carries with it the scent of the river, muddy, green, and ancient. You pause for a moment, watching the linen-covered loaves rise slowly like sleeping cats. The kitchen hums softly, the shuffling of feet, the crackle of fire, and the occasional hiss of dough against hot clay. You know the soggy bottom crisis is always looming. Some loaves will survive. Some will soak up too much Nile air and go limp before the sun sets. But for now, they're rising. And so are your hopes, if only a little. A warm hush settles over the bakery as the loaves finish their second rise. The oven's glow flickers across the walls, dancing like tiny fire spirits in the thick, floury air. You sit beside the resting trays, your back against a cool mud brick wall, watching the steam rise lazily from the morning's earlier batches. Everything feels calm for now. But then Neferhotep taps his knuckle against a calling loaf with a frown. His eyes narrow. "Crust is soft," he mutters. You sit up straighter. The words strike fear into every baker's soul. The eternal battle is upon you. How to keep the inside soft and chewy, while ensuring the outside stays crisp long after the loaf leaves the oven. Because if there's one thing that can ruin an otherwise perfect day of baking, it's biting into a loaf only to find the crust has gone limp. In Egypt's balmy climate, crustiness had a very short lifespan. You might only get a few glorious minutes of crunch before it turns to rubber. It's a cruel joke, like building a pyramid out of wet sand. The solutions? Well, there are many, and they're all fussy. First up, baking technique. You watch as the senior bakers adjust the firewood, shoving palm fronds into the tabon's mouth, and stoking the coals with bellows made from goatskin. The goal is a dry, even heat tricky with an oven that's basically a clay igloo. Ancient ovens, it turns out, were marvels of low-tech engineering. The best ones were bell-shaped, lined with fire-hardened clay, and could hit temperatures high enough to sear your eyebrows off from 3 feet away. And while we think of modern ovens with thermostats and timers, the bakers of Thebes judged heat by feel, sound, and occasionally singed forearms. One baker tosses a small pinch of flour onto the oven wall. It darkens instantly and smokes too. Hot. He nods approvingly. Perfect. Now comes the critical step. Placement. You carry a tray of doughy conical loaves to the oven. Instead of laying them on a flat surface, you press them against the curved inner walls. They cling like fat frogs, slowly crisping in the direct heat. This method ensures one side gets the signature Egyptian crunch while the other side steams. Gently, protected by the loaf's own weight, of course. It's not foolproof. Pull them out early, and they're underkent. Leave them in too long, and they turn into carbonated pottery. But there's a trick that's whispered among bakers: a little touch of oil on the outside before baking. Not too much, or you risk frying the crust into oblivion. Just a slick sheen, often mixed with herbs or crushed fenugreek. It creates a delicate barrier against moisture. You try it now, brushing a few loaves before sliding them in. They sizzle softly like they're sighing. Here's your historical fact. The most commonly baked bread in ancient Egypt was called tar, a round, flat loaf often depicted in tomb paintings and offered to the gods. It was the daily bread of workers, priests, and even royalty. And it had to be presentable because sometimes your offering was meant for Osiris himself. That brings us to the second technique, cooling strategy. You remove a batch of baked loaves from the oven, using thick cloth wraps to avoid burning your hands. The crusts are golden, the smell mouth-watering. But now comes the critical step. You arrange them on a slanted reed rack, elevated off the ground to allow airflow. You flip each loaf halfway through cooling. Why? Because nothing says ruined crust like letting steam gather underneath. Nearby, a junior baker is fanning his loaves with a palm frond. It looks ridiculous, but it works. Moving air keeps the crust dry longer. Some even say it makes the bread sing, a series of faint crackles as the outer shell contracts. You lean in. Crick, crick. It's like the loaf is whispering a lullaby, a fringe tidbit for your collection. Some tombs show small bread altars with loaves stacked in pyramid shapes. The topmost loaves were often hollow or filled with herbs, and archaeologists suspect these were air loaves specifically shaped to resist sogginess and last through the ritual process. Whether they were actually edible is another matter. You wander over to the storage area next. Baskets of finished bread line the walls. Some are wrapped in linen, others sit naked on woven mats. A heavy lid rests on one large jar filled with date bread. You open it. The inside smells amazing spicy and sweet, but the crust gone. The humid air inside has softened it to the consistency of a wet napkin. Neferhotep clucks his tongue disapprovingly. Storage, you learn, is as important as baking. Ancient Egyptians stored bread in ceramic jars, reed baskets, even pits in the ground. But without proper ventilation, the loaves would turn soggy within hours. Some bakers tried drying the loaves after baking, essentially re-toasting them. Others dipped the bottoms in honey or date syrup to form a moisture seal. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Historians still argue whether these techniques were invented for preservation or flavor, or both. Maybe it started with a mistake. Maybe some clever baker just noticed that sticky-bottomed loaves stayed edible longer. That's how so many culinary innovations begin. By accident, then tradition, then obsession. You're starting to get the hang of it now. You rotate your loaves during cooling. You let them rest at an angle. You whisper nice things to them. Okay, maybe not the last part, but you do eye them lovingly as the crust sets and the smell wafts upward. Lunch is called not that there's a big break. You get half a flat loaf and a dollop of bean paste. You eat in the shade of a fig tree, watching a cat stalk something that might be a lizard or just a moving shadow. It's hard work. Crawling, sweaty, thankless. But when you bite into that crusty corner of bread warm, chewy, with just enough snap, it's like a little hymn to the gods. Not just Osiris or Hathor, but the gods of flavor, the gods of timing, the gods of not letting your loaf drown in its own steam. And as you finish your lunch and dust crumbs of your tunic, you think, maybe just maybe you're beginning to win the war against the soggy crust. The sun hangs higher now, a pale disk above the flat skyline of Thebes, and the temperature has officially turned the bakery into something between a sauna and a slow-cooking stew pot. Your tunic is no longer damp, it's just part of you now. There's flour in your eyelashes, possibly in your soul, but there's no time for complaints. Neferhotep has just announced that the afternoon special loaves are ready for the oven. You raise an eyebrow. Special usually means one of two things. They're for someone rich, or they're for someone divine. Either way, the stakes are higher, and so is the chance of being yelled at. Neferhotep gestures toward the largest oven, already crackling with heat. It's time to bake in the royal style. Now, here's something you didn't expect. These elite loaves aren't the ones with gold or spice or exotic fillings. Nope. Their greatness is in their crust, thin, crisp, even all the way around. These were the breads baked for the palaces and temples, where appearances mattered more than practicality. If your crust collapsed, so did your reputation. You and another apprentice start preparing the dough. The flour has been sifted twice through linen to remove grit. The water was drawn from a shaded well to keep it cool. Even the oil smells fancier. There's an unspoken tension in the air, no room for mistakes. Here's your historical fun fact. Ancient Egyptian elite households maintained private bakeries, often staffed by teams of full-time specialists. Some even had their names recorded in tomb inscriptions. Imagine your entire legacy being Amenhotep, crust master of the 5th dynasty. Not bad, honestly. You shape the dough carefully, each loaf must be uniform. No lumps, no wild bubbles, and most importantly, no tears in the surface. A split skin means moisture can creep in during cooling, softening the crust. That's a one-way ticket to you're fired. But historically, Neferhotep approaches with a bowl of what looks like sand. He sprinkles a little over the baking slab before you place the loaves down. You glance at him, confused. Sand? He grins yes. Grins, a rare sight. Dry bottom. Won't stick. Then he walks off like he just revealed the secret to eternal life. That, my friend, is your fringe tidbit of the day. Archaeologists have found evidence suggesting some bakers used clean desert sand beneath loaves to prevent sticking and to absorb excess moisture. It sounds crazy until you realize how effective it is. And don't worry, the sand burns off or shakes off after baking. Mostly, probably. You'll just ignore the gritty bits. You lean over the oven, letting the wall of heat hit you full in the face. It's like hugging a fire-breathing camel. You brace yourself and slide the loaves in with practiced precision, spacing them evenly. A nearby baker hums a low, rhythmic tune. It's supposed to keep your hands steady while loading. You believe it. The rhythm works. You hum it too. Minutes pass. Then longer minutes. The smell begins to shift richer, deeper. The crust begins to blister in tiny bubbles, then harden into a golden shell. You know these loaves are good. You just know. But now comes the real test. Removing them without breaking the crust, you slide your paddle in gently, rocking each loaf free from the oven's curve. They don't resist. They slide off with a soft scrape and land on the cooling tray with the satisfying thump of success. You lift one, tap the underside hollow. Perfect. Neferhotep lifts a loaf, inspects it like a jeweler examining a gem, and then nods. Praise. You could faint from joy or just heat stroke. Either way, you'll take it. You place the loaves on a woven tray layered with reeds. The reeds are dry and slightly aromatic, helping to wick away residual steam. It's another crust-saving trick. Moisture left too long beneath the cooling loaf will soften even the mightiest outer shell. Here's the scholarly debate of this round. Some historians believe these refined crust techniques were reserved only for temple bread. Others argue that skilled bakers across all social levels developed them over time. After all, even the gods presumably didn't want soggy bread. Imagine the embarrassment of offering limp loaves in your afterlife welcome basket. You're given one of the finished crust loaves to deliver personally. It's meant for a local temple scribe, one of the old men who lives on lentils, scrolls, and an irrational love of sesame crust. You wrap the loaf in linen and head out into the sun-blasted street, walking briskly to keep the crust from sweating in the heat. You dodge a cart, sidestep a goat, and gently decline a fish seller's offer to trade you a suspiciously damp mackerel. You reach the scribe's courtyard. He answers the door wearing nothing but a linen kilt and the kind of expression that says, "I've read 4 books this morning, and now deserve carbs." You hand him the loaf. He unwraps it, holds it to his ear, and listens. You can tell from the sound, he says. A good crust speaks. You bow politely, pretending you understand. He takes a bite. There's a sharp crack, followed by a satisfied chew. Bless the bakery, he says with his mouth full. You nod, and in that moment, you feel something of pride, because in a city ruled by gods and gold, you've helped make something that doesn't crumble at the first sign of steam. Something that matters to scribes, priests, nobles, and yes, even to you. As you walk back to the bakery, the afternoon sun bakes the streets into a soft glare. The Nile glitters in the distance. The bakery chimney coughs another puff of smoke into the sky, and somewhere, in that humble kitchen of clay and sweat, your next batch of loaves is rising. You'll need to make sure they survive the next phase, because crust is just the beginning. The real battle is just heating up. The heat of the afternoon presses down like a heavy quilt, and back at the bakery, the air inside now carries a fine mist of flour, steam, and shared exhaustion. Your arms ache. Your hands feel permanently coated in dough, even when they're clean. But Neferhotep has that glint in his eye again. You know what that means. Time for the next strange lesson. He hands you a shallow wooden bowl filled with sand. Again. You give him a look. He gestures toward the next batch of cooling loaves. Dust the bottoms, he says. They'll stay dry longer. You shrug and go to it. As you work, he leans on the wall and begins one of his rare and suspiciously poetic monologues. The best bread, he says, can be left out overnight and still snap when you break it. You nod solemnly. Sounds like baker legend, but there's truth in it. Because once bread comes out of the oven, the crust faces its biggest enemy. Time. The Egyptians, naturally, got creative. One of the older bakers gestures for your help with a new experiment. You follow her to the side of the kitchen where several loaves rest on a strange contraption, a woven reed stand with embers smoldering underneath. Not hot enough to cook anything, just enough to keep things dry. It's a passive warming system, meant to slow down the reabsorption of steam into the crust. It works surprisingly well. You tap a loaf, still hollow, still crisp, still winning. Here's your mainstream fact for the section. Many wealthier households and temple bakeries used passive heating racks like this to extend shelf life. It was a clever way to preserve crust texture without risking overbaking. These weren't just warming stations, they were ancient moisture control devices. And now, for something stranger. The sand bath. You were asked to watch over set of conical loaves placed deliberately into a tree of warm sand. You frown. Isn't sand the enemy? Not exactly. Warm, dry sand could help draw excess moisture out of the crust without overcooking the loaf. Kind of like an edible tanning bed. Historians have found traces of silica embedded in ancient bread crusts, just enough to suggest intentional use, not accidental contamination. It's a fringe theory, but some believe this was part of an effort to keep the loaves dry in the climate's natural humidity. And well, it works. You carefully pull a test loaf from the sand bath. It's toasty, dry to the touch, still beautifully golden. The crust crackles just slightly when you lift it. You bite into a corner and yes, it crunches, loud enough to make a pigeon outside flinch. You're hooked. You start wondering what else you could use. Crushed limestone, charcoal dust, perhaps something more aromatic, dried lavender, if you can sneak some from the market. Not for flavor, necessarily, just for the vibe. You're brought back to reality when Neferhotep claps his hands. The next phase of baking is about to begin, and this one involves your full attention. Today, he announces, you will be preparing a loaf for a temple offering. That means following the ritual specs exactly from the type of flour stone ground. Emma, twice sifted to the water source drawn before sunrise, to the shape of the loaf itself, a pyramid, of course. You prepare the dough carefully, measuring everything by feel. There are no scales here, just years of instinct. Wad's shaped. It's brushed with an oil infused with thyme and crushed coriander. The smell alone could summon the gods. Then comes the cooling. Not on reeds this time, but on a carved alabaster slab. Why? Because cold stone pulls moisture out of the crust fast, without the risk of introducing humidity like clay or fabric might. You're amazed. The loaf cools quickly, forming a tight, even crust within minutes. You realize that, for the Egyptians, bread wasn't just food. It was a science, a ritual, a philosophy wrapped in starch and stubbornness. And at the heart of all that devotion was a simple goal. Don't let the crust go soft. Now, for today's scholarly dispute. Some Egyptologists argue that these crust-saving methods were deliberate, refined over centuries. Others think they were just happy accidents, rituals that stuck because they worked, not because anyone understood why they worked. Maybe the sand bath started as a lazy place to toss cooling loaves. Maybe the alabaster slab was just the nearest surface. Who knows? But one thing is clear. Every baker you've met guards their anti-soak techniques like treasure. They whisper them to apprentices. They grumble them under their breath. They claim divine inspiration. And then they go right back to experimenting, tweaking firewood blends, testing dough shapes, and timing bakes down to the heartbeat. The rest of your afternoon is spent trying variations. You add barley husks to the base of the oven. You layer fig leaves beneath a batch of pyramid loaves. You even try POI drying one batch of dough slightly before baking, just enough to toughen the skin. The results? Mixed. Some successes. One small fire. Neferhotep sighs at you again. A familiar sound. And as the day drifts toward late afternoon, you realize something strange. You're starting to enjoy this process, not just the baking, but the problem solving. The tweaks. The endless, obsessive battle with moisture and crust and time. You're a crust watcher now. A crumb whisperer. A defender of dry bottoms. The sun lowers in the sky. The shadows stretch long across the bakery floor. You take one last loaf from the sand bath and crack it open. Perfect. Tomorrow, you'll try even stranger tricks. But tonight, your crusts have survived the heat. The temple bell tolls in the distance, 3 slow, hollow rings that echo through the alleys of Thebes like yawns at a midnight feast. You glance up from the last cooling tray of the day. Neferhotep claps flour from his hands and nods toward a wicker basket lined with linen. You know what's coming. The bread offerings. Wrapped carefully inside the basket are 6 pyramid-shaped loaves, lightly dusted with sesame seeds and brushed with an aromatic blaze of date syrup and thyme. You tuck the linen tightly over the bread, balancing the bundle against your chest. As you step outside into the honey-colored dusk, the walk to the small temple isn't long, but it's ceremonial. You pass neighbors fanning themselves on low stools, cats curled like commas in the dust, and children chasing dragonflies with fixed sticky fingers. Everyone knows you're not carrying just any bread. These are loaves for the gods. You duck into the temple side entrance, where cool incense wraps around you like a whispered lullaby. A priest accepts your basket with a solemn nod, then lifts each loaf one by one, inspecting the crust. not the dark, not the soft, not I forbid damp bread. In ancient Egypt wasn't merely nutrition. It was offering, currency, status symbol, and divine link. You watch as the priest places the loaves onto a carved stone altar, alongside garlands of lotus petals, bunches of grapes, and the unmistakable fishy stare of a freshly caught tilapia. Balanced offerings for a balanced world. And here's your historical fact. Loaves like these were placed daily on temple altars across Egypt, sometimes as many as 20 or 30 a day per god. Deities were picky eaters, or at least their priests were. The bread had to be fresh, attractive, and notably unsoggy. Stale was acceptable. Soggy was a sin. You tiptoe back outside as the chanting begins, but a strange new task awaits you. Crocodile duty. Yes, crocodiles. You head toward a shaded canal behind the bakery, where a small, muddy enclosure lies waiting. Within, a sluggish, lark-like beast blinks up at you with one baleful yellow eye. Meet Sobek's favorite petty officer Krusty. The bakery contributes weekly bread offerings to the nearby crocodile temple, where the creatures are treated as semi-divine and apparently semi-carb-loaded. You drop a loaf just outside the gate and back away slowly. Officer Krusty lurches forward and devours it whole, sand, sesame seeds, and all. Crunch achieved. This is where things get quirky. Certain loaves were specially baked for animals as ritual feed. But here's the weirdest bit. Those animal loaves were often extra dry, hard as bricks, shaped for easy stacking, and baked with inert ingredients so they wouldn't spoil or ferment. In other words, these loaves were built to last and most definitely not to go soggy, and some scholars believe they weren't meant to be eaten at all. There's a fringe theory that suggests these loaves function symbolically, offerings made durable enough to remain present until the next batch arrived, like spiritual placeholders. Now here's where the scholars get grumbly. There's debate about whether gods or their animal surrogates actually consumed offerings. Some think it was all symbolic. The bread absorbed divine energy, and then priests took it home. Yes, really. Others argue that even animals like Sobek's sacred crocodiles were used in theatrical rituals, meant to assure villagers that the gods were indeed feasting. Because who could doubt a crocodile chewing? Back at the bakery, you join a few others preparing a special batch for a fertility rite. These loaves are shaped like ducks, don't ask why, and filled with spiced lentils. They're elaborate, gorgeous, and topped with a glaze of tamarind and honey. But you notice something curious. Once again, the crust is exceptionally dry. You ask Neferhotep, and he chuckles. Wetter loaves fall apart on the altar, he says, and no one wants duck soup for an offering. You get it now. The sogginess war wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Dry bread was disciplined. It held its shape. It behaved. Later that night, with the loaves cooling on the long bench near the door, you perch beside them, half dozing. In the spice-sweet air, someone lights a small oil lamp nearby. You listen to the crackle of sesame seeds, still popping as the heat escapes their shells. You start to imagine other odd offerings Egyptians might have tried. Scented bread, yes, bread shaped like ears, also yes, used in healing spells. You wonder if someone ever tried writing a prayer on a loaf. Probably. These were, after all, the same people who invented ink, calendars, and cat makeup. Your stomach growls, and you sneak a bite from a test loaf, the edge only. The crust is firm, aromatic, gently sweet from the date syrup. The center is warm, pillowy, slightly spiced, not soggy in the slightest. And with that, your head nods, your eyes flutter, and the sacred stillness of the temple bread hour settles around you like dust on linen. You'll wake early tomorrow, of course. But for now, the gods have their bread. The crocodiles are fed, and your baker's heart is satisfied. It's just past dawn, and the air already smells like yeast, ash, and something oddly fruity. You stretch your flour-crusted arms, push open the creaky shutters, and catch a drift of bubbling song from next door. The brewery is alive. Yes, beer. That other ancient Egyptian staple. It isn't exactly what you think, more of a grain porridge than a crisp, bubbly lager, but it's everywhere. And this morning, you're headed there on a quick errand that somehow turns into a whole lesson in boozy baking. You shuffle over with a clay jar tucked under one arm, dodging a sleepy goat and two kids arguing over a stick. At the brewery, giant vats steam in the early light, filling the air with a sour, sweet aroma, not unlike overripe bananas crossed with damp barley. It's a lot. Inside, you're greeted by the brewer's assistant, a chatty woman named Merit, who talks fast, stirs faster, and insist that bread and beer are just cousins who took different career paths. You're not here to argue. While she ladles frothy beer mash into your jar, she lets slip a tip. You bakers always forget the best loaves rise on yesterday's brew. She's referring to bappa, a fermented bread mash that could double as either food or the base for beer. In fact, many scholars think beer and bread were once indistinguishable thick porridgey brews that, when left too long in the sun, began to bubble and change. One errant bowl of soggy grains might have been the world's first sourdough starter. You carry your prize back to the bakery, careful not to spill. The yeast-rich liquid is perfect for kickstarting fermentation. Today's batch of bread will be made with a beer sponge, a bubbly, tangy paste added to the flour to give your loaves lift and flavor. You begin mixing. The smell is intense, slightly funky, but promising. The dough sighs under your hands like a lazy cat. You knead slowly, folding the yeasty mixture into the flour, water, and salt, and let it rest beneath a damp cloth. You feel like a magician coaxing a spell to life. Here's your mainstream fact. Egyptian beer was a dietary staple safer than river water and filling enough to count as a meal. Workers on royal tombs were often paid in both bread and beer, forming what some modern historians cheekily call the carbohydrate economy. But here's the quirky bit. Sometimes Egyptians intentionally used beer to prevent sogginess. They'd add a spoonful of strong brew to stiffen dough or to ferment it slightly before baking. The alcohol content helped ward off mold in humid weather, and the natural acidity gave bread a longer shelf life, especially handy when you're stocking up for a feast or, the afterlife. Now here's where historians squint. No one fully agrees on the line between baking and brewing in ancient Egypt. Was all bread made with beer dregs? Did beer come from leftover bread? Some argue that early loaves were baked partly as beer concentrates, dried lumps meant to be rehydrated later for drinking. It's all a bit circular, but you're not worried about academic arguments right now. You're watching your dough rise like a sun on linen. It bubbles faintly, the scent going from sharp to mellow. You punch it down, gently this time, and shape it into small rounds. While you work, Neferhotep drops another surprise. You're on breakfast duty, which means you'll be baking flatbreads for the crew and brewing the other breakfast drink. A thin, warm porridge like beer with honey and dates. Kind of like barley soup, but with a kick. You roll out dough circles, toss them onto a hot griddle, and ladle beer into clay mugs. The bakery smells divine. Toasted grains, bubbling brew, and that rich, homey scent that makes everyone just little nicer than usual. As your crew gathers to eat, you notice something. Not a single loaf is soggy. The crusts are crisp, the center's light. Maybe it's the beer. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's Officer Krusty's approval from yesterday giving you some celestial kitchen luck. Outside, someone begins to sweep. Inside, the mugs clink and a sleepy lull settles over the bakery like a warm blanket. You think about how many mornings like this have happened over thousands of years. Just hands dough, bubbling beer, and the quiet satisfaction of a job nearly done. One of your fellow bakers lifts his mug and says, "To good bread and bad beer." Everyone laughs. You don't know why it's funny, but it is. And you know what? You kind of agree. The sun climbs higher, and with it, the buzz of the marketplace just beyond your street wall. But you're not headed there today. No, you've been assigned a mission of curiosity. Assist old Hinutmehite with an experimental loaf. Hinutmehite is not technically a baker anymore. She's more like the bakery's living archive, a retired matron who still shows up daily, trailing stories, spices, and unsolicited advice. Today, she wants to recreate a bread recipe that might have been served at a priest's feast in Heliopolis 2 dynasties ago. You follow her instructions carefully. Dates soaked in pomegranate juice, ground coriander, 2 fistfuls of emmer flour, and her special touch a sprinkle of blue lotus powder. Not too much, she warns, unless you want dreams that swim. You're not entirely sure whether she's joking. The dough smells floral, earthy, and a little bit mysterious. It's sticky and delicate, more like cake batter than traditional loaf. You pour it into a round clay form, glazed with honey, and set it beside the embers. Hinutmehite prefers a slow, smoky bake. While you wait, she tells you about ritual loaves, shaped like ankhs, crafted specifically for ceremonial use. These weren't daily bread, they were event loaves, born for rites of passage, temple dedications, or funerals. Some had inlays of herbs or were decorated with tiny sculpted falcons, as if to say, "Yes, this is just bread, but it's also a holy vessel. And it definitely isn't soggy. Here's your mainstream fact. Ancient Egyptians often used shaped bread in religious rituals. Common symbols included Ank's life, Scarab's rebirth, and the DJ'd peerless stability. These loaves weren't just food, they were offerings and communication tools. But today's quirky highlight. Occasionally, these sacred loaves were painted, not with food coloring, but with mineral pigments like malachite green or ochre red. Some historians believe these weren't meant to be eaten at all, they were visual prayers. Others suggest the colors denoted different types of blessing, fertility, wisdom, protection, or healing. The loaf you've made with hinatmehite emerges a little cracked on top, but the aroma is intoxicating. You slice into it, and the center is dense but springy, not soggy moist, but stable. She pinches a corner and hums approvingly. Could serve this to Thutmose himself, she says. As you nibble the edge of your creation. You both discuss the grand funerary banquets you've only heard of, tables heaped with breads, meats, fruits, and wine. But bread always came first. The most important people were offered not gold, not jewels, but fresh loaves, fragrant and enduring, which brings you to a scholarly debate that still rumbles among Egyptologists. Did bread play a larger role in funeral rites than we give it credit for? Some evidence suggests loaves were deliberately overbaked to last longer in tombs. Others think that burial breads were dumb as bread in shape, not substance. Like wooden ducks, but for dinner. You let your mind drift while hinatmehite hums an old harvest song. You picture yourself baking in a tomb kitchen, far below ground, with stone walls carved full of recipes, maybe even doodles of bakers with wild hair and sleepy eyes just like yours. Then she drops this final bit of trivia. The best bakers were often blind. You blink at her, unsure you heard right. But yes, it's true, there are depictions of blind bakers throughout tomb art. One theory is that blindness, often caused by sand infections or long exposure to heat, was seen not as a hindrance, but as a sign of dedication. Others argue it's symbolic, showing bakers as humble, spiritual workers. You glance at your hands, floury and warm, and wonder what the job will do to you in 20 years. Sore wrists, dusty lungs, a strange new respect for crust, probably all three. The day rolls on gently, filled with soft laughter, the shuffle of feet, and the cooling hush of late afternoon. You and hinatmehite wrap the remaining slices in palm fronds and tuck them into a basket. Maybe you'll bring them to the potters next door, maybe to the priests, or maybe you'll just eat them behind the bakery when no one's looking, because some bread, especially the weird, experimental kind, isn't made for gods or records. It's made to be eaten, remembered, and maybe smiled at in your dreams. The shadows stretch longer now, curling around the corners of the bakery like lazy cats. You've cleaned your hands on the edge of your tunic more times than you can count, but they still carry the faint perfume of toasted grain and honeyed ash. Neferhotep, ever the reluctant mentor, announces that it's your turn to fire up the clay oven, a domed beast of sun-baked brick with a temperamental streak and a penchant for scolding anyone who approaches with arrogance. It's not just fire, he warns, handing you a long-handled paddle and a gourd of water. It's diplomacy. You're courting the goddess of flame. You roll your eyes, then promptly cinch your forearm. Once you've stopped hissing and pacing in circles, you set to work. First, you stoke the oven with dried palm fronds and donkey dung, yes, donkey dung, which burns surprisingly clean and hot. When the air inside begins to shimmer, and you can't hold your hand near the mouth for more than 2 seconds, it's ready. You sprinkle the oven floor with sand, and carefully slide in your loaves, small, round, and brushed with beer foam to help the crust darken just right. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Egyptians were pioneers of the domed clay oven, an innovation that allowed for higher, more consistent baking temperatures than open fire pits. These ovens, called taban in some regions, were often communal. Neighbors took turns baking, especially during festivals. But you are not the only one dancing with fire today. Across the courtyard, a potter tests the kilns. Sparks fly, the air smells like sunburned river mud, and somewhere overhead, a kite screeches. It's a symphony of smoke and ambition. Now here's your quirky bit. To test oven temperature, some bakers tossed in a ball of dough and timed how fast it charred. Others, more creatively, would toss in a beetle. If the beetle made it out alive, the oven wasn't hot enough. Don't worry, you opt for the dough method. As your first loaf puffs, you notice a problem. The crust forms too fast. It's beautiful, golden, but inside, it's gooey. Soggy, even. You frown. This is a classic error. Overheat without steam, and now it clicks. Neferhotep, who has been watching with that smart, "I let you figure it out" grin, finally speaks. We prevent sogginess not with heat, but with layers. He shows you a trick. Older than the pharaohs. Between the fire and the dough, you slide in a thin tile unglazed pottery, warmed just enough. The bread rests on it like a throne. Then he tosses a splash of water against the oven wall. Steam bursts upward, surrounding the loaf in a warm, wet hug. This, paradoxically, gives you a crispier crust and a fully cooked center, steam baking. Ancient style. Here's where the scholars still debate. Some argue the Egyptians used double-layered oven floors or even suspended baking dishes to avoid direct contact with heat. Others think they covered dough in inverted pots to trap steam. No definitive method survives, but the evidence lies in the bread. Many excavated loaves are flat-bottomed, yet domed on top, suggesting some sort of enclosed, radiant environment. As your loaves rise just so, you allow yourself to smile. The sogginess is gone. The crust sings when tapped. Neferhotep nods. Not bad. For someone who set their sleeve on fire an hour ago. You remove each loaf with care, laying them on a reed mat to cool. The scent is heavenly, rich, toasty, slightly sour from the beer sponge. It smells like home, though not your home exactly. More like the one you've borrowed for a few thousand years. The final batch is special. Crescent loaves, made with spiced egg paste in the middle and brushed with sesame oil. Reserved for the priest's table. You deliver them under the cover of dusk. The city bathed in orange and pink, each roofline glowing like a charcoal ember. The temple gatekeeper inspects your basket. He's grumpy until he smells the bread. Then his eyebrows soften, and then, a surprise, he hands you a folded scrap of linen. Inside, a stamped clay token, your name carved into it, paired with the bakery mark. You've just earned official delivery status. You blink. You didn't even know that was a thing. Neferhotep, of course, already knew. Means you're allowed to complain now, he mutters. Only real bakers complain. And as you walk home, token in hand, soot on your sleeves, flour in your hair, you feel it. Not pride, exactly. Something softer. Like the feeling of a perfectly baked loaf, warm through the center, crust kissed by steam. No sogginess in sight. It's been a long day, but a good one. By now, the moon has lifted itself lazily into the sky, casting a pale sheen across the Nile and turning the dusty rooftops of Thebes into a sea of silver shingles. But your work isn't quite done. You trudge back toward the bakery, that little square of crumbling walls and glowing coals that has become your second home. You expected everyone to have cleared out by now, but instead, you find the apprentices seated in a circle, munching on scraps and whispering excitedly. At the center of the group sits a man you've never met before, with deep lines etched into his face like a well-used bread mold. He wears an amulet in the shape of a hippopotamus, which makes no immediate sense until someone whispers, "That's Barkit Konsu, the traveling yeast merchant." You blink. A yeast merchant? Yes, apparently that's a thing. Here's your mainstream fact. The Egyptians relied on wild yeast, often harvested from beer foam, to leaven their bread. But more advanced bakeries, especially in temples or elite households, maintain specific strains of sourdough starter, passed down like heirlooms. Merchants like Barkit Konsu traveled between cities, exchanging different ferments for coin, dates, or recipes. He opens a pouch and offers you a sniff. You lean in. It smells like apricots, smoke, and something oddly medicinal, maybe fennel. This particular starter, he claims, is descended from a batch used in a temple bakery during the reign of Amenhotep III. Still lively, he says, tapping the gourd it's stored in. Still hungry? You glance at Neferhotep, who shrugs and nods. So you trade 2 fig cakes and a clean paddle for a chunk of ancient goo. And that's when Barkit Konsu begins to tell you how to keep it alive. This isn't just food, it's a pet. Feed it daily with flour and water. Keep it shaded. Never refrigerate. Refrigerators haven't been invented yet, after all. And never ever give it to a cat. Cats kill yeast, he mutters, which is possibly a metaphor or possibly just superstition. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some bakers believe that sourdough starter worked best if stirred with a gold spoon once a week. Others swore by chanting over the dough. One text fragment even suggests placing the jar beneath a statue of Bes, the dwarf god of home, laughter, and fertility, to encourage a lively rise. Historians still argue whether these rituals were taken seriously or simply part of the theatrical flair surrounding Egyptian cooking. Was it science? Magic? Both, as Barkit Konsu spins tales of yeast gone rogue batches that swallowed entire kneading rooms or fermented so violently they crack their jars you feel yourself getting sleepy. Maybe it's the warmth, maybe it's the repetition, maybe it's the steady scent of toasting flour still lingering in your clothes. Then he hands you a wooden amulet shaped like a loaf, no larger than your thumb. For luck, he says. Hang it near your starter. It listens. You don't question it, not because you're convinced, but because after a long day of coaxing stubborn dough into something beautiful, you understand how easily rational minds begin to drift toward myth. Later, in the quiet corner of the bakery, you find an old jar tucked away under a stone bench. It's labeled only with a mark that looks suspiciously like Neferhotep's grumpy scowl. Inside, a dried-out lump of starter, cracked and pale, abandoned, maybe, or maybe just resting. You place the new starter beside it, whisper something half silly, half sincere, and seal the jar with linen. Tomorrow, you'll feed it. You'll name it. You'll try to make it rise. But tonight, you just sit there a while longer, listening to the gentle creak of the bakery's roof beams, the rustle of date palms, the slow hiss of a dying coal. You're surrounded by bread, stories, and microbes older than empires. And for now, that's enough. The stars wheel overhead, indifferent and eternal. But down here in the half-lit silence of your clay-walled world, you begin to sense time in a different way, not in hours or days, but in loaves. Each round of dough marks a passing ritual, each rise a promise. And in the morning, before the city even yawns, the baking begins again. But today, there's a twist. Neferhotep tells you to make ritual loaves, funeral bread. He mutters, already elbow-deep in date paste, so don't mess it up. You blink at him. Bread for the dead. Mainstream fact time. In ancient Egypt, bread was a crucial offering in funerary rites. Tombs were stocked with symbolic food items to sustain the deceased in the afterlife, most commonly beer and loaves. These were sometimes made from real grain, other times sculpted in clay or wax, especially if they were just for show.so. You're not baking for breakfast, you're baking for eternity. Neferhotep lays out the plan. First, the shapes matter. Oval for offerings to Osiris, conical for solar rituals. Some loaves are twisted into spirals or knotted to resemble intestines, not because ancient Egyptians had a thing for gut shapes, but because these forms were thought to mimic life's inner workings, or possibly just looked fancy on the altar. Next comes the flour. You're told to sift it through a woven sieve 3 times until it's finer than temple incense powder. The process is slow, meditative. The grains hiss as they pass through. You imagine this is what it sounds like when the gods whisper. Then there's the decoration. One loaf receives a dusting of crushed lotus petals. Another is pressed with a wooden seal shaped like a scarab beetle said to ward off rot, both physical and spiritual. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some funerary loaves were baked with a tiny clay figure inside, sort of like a proto-king cape. If the figure cracked, it was bad luck for the deceased. If it stayed whole, it meant the afterlife would be prosperous and possibly gluten-rich. Historians still argue whether these figures were symbolic helpers for the dead, or simply part of a baking superstition that spiraled out of control. Either way, it adds a certain pressure. The ovens hum low as you slide in your offerings. You whisper a little something to the bread, not a prayer really, but a kind of promise. Rise well, bake clean, don't crumble in the hands of the embalmer. As the loaves core, you help wrap them in linen bundles. One apprentice even adds a sprig of blue cornflower between the folds. For the car, she says, the part of the soul that stays behind. You carry them across town under a quilt of dawn fog toward the necropolis. Even from here, you can smell the sweet pungent scent of resin and spice. The priests are already mid-chant, their voices weaving in and out like reeds in the wind. The funeral isn't sad, not in the way you expect. It's more like a graduation, a very solemn picnic. You hand over the basket to a man in leopard skin robes, who inspects each loaf like a museum curator, and when he nods, you feel something shift inside, like you've contributed to something sacred, or at least something durable. Because here's the thing, bread may mold, crumble, fade, but the act of making it, that lingers. Later, you pass the city bakery, where a mother is handing a tiny roll to her toddler, who immediately drops it in the dust. You can't help but laugh. Sacred or not, bread is still bread, and toddlers are still toddlers. You return to the bakery, when Neferhotep is napping under the bench, and someone has made tea out of mint and river herbs. You sit, sip, and stare into the coals, and you realize, in a land where kings are mummified, and pyramids reach for the heavens, it's easy to overlook the humble loaf. But here, in your flour-stained fingers, it feels like the most human thing of all. You wake the next day to the gentle clatter of clay jars and the distant sound of a donkey braying at absolutely nothing. You stretch, yawn, and remember the loaves you baked for the dead. Their warm weight, their perfect crusts. Then, the peculiar thought hits you. Maybe that bread will outlast you. It wouldn't be the first time. You shuffle into the bakery storage room, a cool, shadowy alcove tucked behind shelves of tools and amphorae. Neferhotep gestures at the rows of baskets stacked high, wrapped in linen and tied with date fibber cords. Inventory day. He grunts. Time to count the old stuff. You nod. Boring, but necessary. Especially since some of the bread in here is destined to become taxes. Yes, that's your mainstream fact. Bread functioned as a form of currency in ancient Egypt. Workers could be paid in loaves and beer. Temples collected grain, baked it, and distributed it in rations. Bakers themselves owed portions of their yield as tax to local officials, kind of like the world's crustiest IRS. You open the first basket and nearly drop it. Inside is a rock-hard loaf that looks more like a fossil than food. It's marked with a date from last season, sealed with wax, and labeled with a name in faded ink, likely destined for a government greenhouse. But not all loaves age so gracefully. One basket reveals something that smells off. You poke it with a stick. It squelches. Neferhotep wrinkles his nose. Left it too damp, he mutters. Mold demon got to it. You laugh, until he adds, I'm not joking. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some bakers believe that bread that went moldy too quickly had been cursed, either by jealous competitors or by neglecting the proper protective rituals. Remedies included hanging garlic above the storage room, whispering spells into the grain sacks, or even smearing a protective line of honey along the shelf edge. Historians still argue whether these practices were rooted in early microbial observation or sheer magical thinking. After all, honey does have antibacterial properties, but garlic spells? Still unproven. You keep sorting. Some loaves are thin and flat, meant for portable meals. Others are almost ornamental, braided, laced with date, syrup, and sprinkled with crushed herbs. Display bread, Neferhotep calls them, for festivals or snooty priests. One of the apprentices holds up a loaf that's cracked and pitted with tiny holes. Mice, she guesses. But Neferhotep shakes his head. Beetles, apparently. There was once a season when grain beetles infested half the bakeries in Thebes. You sigh and toss the loaf into the compost bin. Pest control in ancient times meant setting out traps made of sweet paste, or releasing toads into the storerooms. An adorable, if slightly chaotic, solution. Hours pass. Your back aches. Your arms are dusted in flour again. But eventually the storeroom is sorted and the ledgers updated. The loaves for tax are bundled into baskets, labeled and loaded onto a rickety cart. You get to ride along, jostling through narrow streets as donkeys sneeze at you and vendors shout about figs, fans, and sandals. The tax office, surprisingly, smells like cinnamon and ink. A scribe in long robes counts the loaves, nods, and scrawls a receipt onto a papyrus scrap. He hands it to you with no smile. Civil servants have never been particularly cheerful, it seems. Outside, a market unfolds noisy. Sun-drenched, full of motion, someone is frying onions. A flute trills in the background. Children chase a chicken, and amid it all, you spot something odd. A store selling miniature bread amulets, strung on linen cord. You approach. The vendor, a woman with a missing tooth and a warm laugh, explains that these are charms to protect travelers, honor ancestors, or bring good harvests. You can eat them, she says, but they're mostly for prayers. You buy one, shaped like a perfect little spiral, almost too lovely to eat. Almost. Later, you return to the bakery and hang the charm by the oven, right next to the yeast jar. You don't really believe in all the old superstitions, but still, can't hurt. And as you sit down with a cup of barley tea, staring at shelves of aging, drying, mold-warding, tax-paying bread, you realize something odd. Every loaf tells a story, and in its own quiet, crumbly way, each one is a record of time, not etched in stone, not chiseled on walls, but written in flour. The days grow warmer. The Nile pulls back just a little more each morning, its lazy glisten revealing more mud, more silt, and unfortunately for you, more baking to do. Because now it's festival season. and when festival season comes, so do the orders. The priests show up at sunrise with a long scroll and zero appreciation for your need to stretch. 50 loaves, the head priest says, in the shape of sacred animals. You glance at Neferhotep, who's already grimacing. Again, mainstream fact, festivals in ancient Egypt, especially those honoring deities like Hathor, Bastet, or Amun, involved elaborate offerings, and bread was always front and center. But not just regular loaves, symbolic bread sculptures shaped like birds, fish, snakes, and even divine cows. You, dear baker's assistant, are now a sculptor. The dough is stiffer for these. More flour or less water. You knead it into animal forms that look, let's be honest, a little haunted. Your cut loaf is more angry frog, and the crocodile vaguely resembles a boot. But Neferhotep doesn't fuss. The gods have imagination. He shrugs. For detail work, you use carved wooden stamps. One has falcon wings, another a lotus petal swirl. A third depicts a seated baboon. And you sincerely hope it's supposed to be a god and not someone's pet. The baking takes twice as long, not just because of the shapes, but because the festival requires ritual baking rhythms, a fancy way of saying start the fire, stop it, start it again. The idea is to mirror the sun's journey across the sky, which sounds poetic until your ankles are numb and your left arm smells faintly of singed dough. Quirky tidbit for you. Some temples were so strict about this rhythm that they employed special bread-time singers whose songs acted as timers. Instead of sunglasses, you'd hear a chant about eyes morning rays while shaping the dough, and a slower hymn about sunset while you waited for it to cool. Historians still argue whether these chants were standardized across Egypt or varied wildly from temple to temple. Some scrolls show near identical lyrics. Others hint at local priests inventing wildly different baking ballads. One particularly odd example references the goose who dances with yeast as you pack the finished loaves into baskets lined with reeds. A young priest approaches. He picks up your boot-shaped crocodile, tilts it, and says, "The tale could use more definition." You briefly consider flinging a spoon at him, but decide that would probably anger Amun. The loaves are carried through the city in a colorful parade. You walk along, the sunlight bouncing off bronze bangles and painted fans. People line the streets. Children run up, trying to steal the sweet loaves shaped like ducks dotted to the temple. The bread is laid on stone altars, surrounded by fruits, gardens, and bowls of honey. Drums thump in a slow rhythm, and the scent of incense rises in thick spirals. It's mesmerizing, in a sweaty, slightly smoky kind of way. You find a shady spot and sit down. One of the dancers offers you a fig stuffed bun from her basket. It's sticky, warm, and absurdly good. You close your eyes for just a moment. When you open them, the sun is lower, and the altars are empty. The gods have been fed. The leftovers given to the poor, or eaten by the temple staff. Nothing goes to waste, except maybe your artistic pride. Back at the bakery, Neferhotep surprises everyone with a batch of festival beer bread, a denser, malty loaf made with leftover brew. For you, he says, handing it over. You earned it. It's chewy, a little sour, but you don't mind. It tastes like celebration and mild exhaustion. You sit in the courtyard as twilight hums over the rooftops. Somewhere, a flute plays a gentle tune. You hear someone arguing over papyrus prices. A goat sneezes. Life goes on. You think about all the bread you've made. For gods, for taxes, for funerals, for picky priests, and somehow it all matters. Not because it's perfect, but because it was made. You feel sleep tugging at you, like the slow curl of the Nile at dusk, and somewhere in your flour-dusted mind, quiet thought rises. Bread doesn't have to last forever, just long enough to mean something. Morning arrives, not with fanfare, but with the gentle shuffle of sandals across stone, and the lazy flap of a reed curtain in the breeze. You rise slowly, your muscles stiff but oddly satisfied. Today feels quieter. The ovens are cold, the bakery still. You stretch your back and wander out into the courtyard, where Neferhotep is seated with a reed brush, scribbling something onto a scrap of papyrus. He grunts a greeting, offers you a date, and gestures toward a basket beside him. Inside are a dozen loaves, small, round, and speckled with sesame. Simple, unglazed, meant for barter with the fishermen across the river. Mainstream fact. In many smaller Egyptian communities, money as we think of it didn't really circulate. Instead, bartering, especially with food like bread, was a daily part of survival. One fish might equal 2 loaves, a handful of figs Half a loaf. It wasn't precise, but it worked. Go on, Neferhotep says, flicking his hand. You've and a river walk. You pack the basket, throw on a faded linen shawl, and start the journey down the dust-packed road toward the docks. Your sandals crunch on sand and scattered grain, and the air is thick with the mingled smells of lake water and grilled onions. You pass a family patching a fishing net, a child feeding dates to a monkey, a real one, not a sibling, and a vendor trying to convince a goat to wear a necklace made of dried lotus. When you reach the docks, the fisherman barefoot, sun dark, and with a beard like storm clouds greets you with a wave and a yawn. He eyes your basket. Bread? You nod. Still warm. He nods back, disappears into his boat, and emerges with a string of silver-scaled tilapia. Trade made. No contracts. Just trust, ritual, and the mutual understanding that bread, like fish, is fleeting and essential. As you walk back, a breeze kicks up, dust swirls, a dog barks at its own tail, and then you hear it. Laughter from the plaza. Curious, you follow the sound to a gathering of neighbors clustered around a storyteller, their faces lit by the low golden light of late morning. The storyteller holds up a broken loaf and launches into an elaborate, utterly fabricated tale about a priest who tried to fake his own death to avoid paying bread taxes, only to be discovered when he showed up in the afterlife without a proper funeral loaf. It's absurd. It's possibly true, and it makes the crowd roar. Quirky tidbit for the day. There were actually written complaints recorded in tomb texts about inadequate funerary bread some souls believe they were cursed with. Subpar afterlife meals because their relatives cheaped out on offerings. Historians still argue whether these grievances were symbolic, literal, or just ancient passive aggression etched in stone. You laugh along, then return to the bakery, where Neferhotep is cleaning the stone oven with a bundle of thyme and reads an old trick to keep the hearth fragrant. You asked him what he's writing. He grunts. Recipes. You can write. No, but I know someone who can. He shrugs. Thought it was time someone wrote down what we do. You blink. That feels important, because for all the papyrus scrolls dedicated to pharaohs, priests, and war, someone should remember the bakers, the ones who kept the people fed, the ones who understood yeast and sun and time. You sit beside him, scribble a few symbols, try to remember how to draw a loaf with a double crust. Later, as the sun droops behind the rooftop jars, and the Nile sighs in the distance, you return to your favorite perch beneath the fig tree behind the bakery. Your back resting against sun-warmed stone, you take out one last loaf from your basket. Small, still soft, sprinkled with cumin. You take a bite. It tastes like work. It tastes like home. And as your eyes grow heavier, the sounds of Egypt lull you. The rustle of reeds, the far-off hum of market sellers, the whisper of flour shifting in its jar. Here, in this quiet moment between baking and dreaming, between the living and the long gone, you realize something simple. Every civilization is built on stories, and every story needs bread. Wind down 3 words. So now, let yourself settle. Let the scent of warm grain and toasted spice linger a little longer in your thoughts. Let the dusty streets fade gently into soft shadows. The chatter of the market dissolving into the quiet hum of evening. Feel the weight of the day fall away, like a cloth gently shaken free of flour. The Nile glides slowly, now no rush, no urgency. Just an endless ribbon of calm, threading its way through the cradle of time. A breeze rustles the papyrus by the riverbank, and overhead, the sky deepens into velvet blue. Somewhere, a baker hums a tune you can't quite name, as dough rises under a linen wrap. Somewhere, a temple door swings closed for the night. And, somewhere, a young apprentice lies back beneath a fig tree, dreaming of loaves that never burn and ovens that always glow just right. There's nothing you need to do now. No taxes to pay, no animals to shape from dough, no gods to please, at least not tonight. Only rest. The fire has gone out. The flour is sifted. The yeast has done its part. And so have you. So breathe in. Breathe out. Let it all go. Let your thoughts soften like fresh dough under warm hands. Let your breath settle like flour in a jar. And as sleep begins to take hold, remember, you made bread, and that's more than enough.